Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave, and this tutorial is part of a Learn React tutorial series. I've got a link to the full playlist for this tutorial series in the description below. In the last tutorial, we put a fetch items function using async, await, and the fetch API inside of the useEffect hook in our app component. And this functional app component is the parent component for the rest of the components in our application. And here, we are also simulating a call to an API using a 2-second timeout, but we're really running a local JSON server instance and we're accessing the data from our db.json file. So if you didn't see that tutorial, hit that playlist link in the description below and go back to it for that setup. I'm going to pick up right where we left off because we're requesting the data from the API, and that goes ahead and loads it in here, and we've got our console list items I need to remove here once again. I'll do that and save, and so there's the completed fetch items function that is called inside of the useEffect. And since we've completed that, we need to go ahead and link up the rest of the CRUD operations, and those would be, this is read as far as CRUD goes, we're reading the data, but these other operations would be create for creating a list item, update for updating a list item, and delete for deleting a list item. So let's go ahead and put those in place as well. So now instead of being in the app component, I'm going to press Control B as in boy to show the file tree here in VS Code. And I want to add a file, and I'll click the new file icon. I'm going to type API and then a capital R and spell the word request.js. So this is API request. And here I'm going to create a function that we can import to use for all of these other operations. So we'll be abstracting some, and this will allow us to use this one function for create, update, and delete. We'll start out with a const, and we'll call this API request, and it's going to be an async function, and it's going to accept a URL, and we'll put in a default parameter that is just an empty string, and then it's going to accept an options object. I'm going to press Control B once again to hide the file tree now, and this will be set to null as default to start out. And it's also going to have an error message, and this is also going to be set to null to start out. From there, we'll put in the arrow for our arrow function, and now we'll be able to define our function. But we also need to remember to export this function. So at the bottom, just like we do with a component, we can put export default and put API request. Okay, with that setup out of the way, let's go ahead and start with a try block as we would with any request. And the setup inside would also have a catch for an error. And then it's going to have a finally at the end that happens whether we've had an error or not. This will always execute after the try and catch blocks. So now that we have our three blocks, let's define our generic request, and this will be defining a response that we expect to receive, and we'll set that equal to await fetch, and we'll use the URL, and fetch also accepts an options object, and that's what we'll have, which is the second parameter that we have here for our API request function as well. So we'll accept both of those, and really the options object is what makes the difference between this being a create, update, or delete request. After that, we'll check to see if the response is okay or not. And this is a lot like our fetch function that is back in the useEffect of the app component. And this is saying if we do not have an okay response, if it's not in the 200 range, maybe we had a 404, we want to catch that and throw an error because we know that will not be automatically caught as an error. It's just a response that we didn't want. And here we'll put, please reload the app. And of course, in our message that is shown in our display, when we get an error, it will also say error, but we already have that coded in. So here we'll just say, please reload the app. And that's because at this point, the state of the application may not be in sync with the database. If we've had an error with creating, updating, or deleting, they'd be out of sync. We reload, we'll get that data back from the server once again, and our state will be updated to be in sync with the server. So that's why I've got a please reload message. After that, let's go ahead and define the error message in the catch block, and we'll set the error message equal to error.message. And then in the finally block, this is where we actually want to return the error message. So no matter what, this return will happen, whether the error message is null or whether it actually has a value. And we don't really need the responses back from the API here. We'll go ahead and put a semicolon there as well. And the reason we don't need those responses back is because we're updating the state with our set items and other set functions that we would call from our state. However, that does not update the API. And we want to keep the state of our application and the API in sync, but we can update the state and see that faster than we may get a response from the API. So we don't want to wait for that response. We'll just instantly show the new state in the application, but then if we get an error message, we'll know we're out of sync with the API, and then we'll show the please reload the app message here, or whatever other error might actually occur that would be caught by the catch block here. We could show that message as well. So this is our function. That's really all there is to it. And the difference between the requests will be the create, update, or delete that is held in the options object. And we'll define those in the separate handlers. So let's save this API request. Now let's go back to the app component. Now in the app component, let's go ahead and import this function. We'll import API request from API request. And now let's put this API request function to work. And the first place we could use it is in the add item function. We've already got everything we need here to update our state, and we do it right here with the set items. But besides that, we want to go ahead and update the REST API as well. So here let's define the post options, because this will be a post request. And I'll set that equal to an object, and we'll define the method, and that will be post. And after the method, we'll define headers. Now headers is an object all of its own. Oh, we need lowercase, there we go. Headers, and so this is an object. And inside the headers, we'll define the content dash type. And this will be application slash JSON. And then we can put a comma after that headers object, and we need to define the body. And for the body, the information we want to send, we need to use JSON stringify, and here we can pass in my new item as we defined above. Again, we don't need to send, whoops, we don't need that semicolon. We don't need to send the full list of items like we set the items here in our state. We just need the new item that we want to post to the REST API. And that was defined by my new item up here above. And with that, we've completed our post options. So now let's go ahead and define the REST and send the request. So we want to say const result equals, oh, and this is await, and remember our API request was an async function, so we need to change our add item to an async function up here above. And that way we can await the API request, and we can pass in the API URL that we defined at the top. And if you remember, that was a constant, and here it is as we just opened the app component function. And for a post request, we don't need to do anything other than send it to the same API URL that we send the GET request, but the method being different will handle the request differently. And this is a post request, so we're just sending it to the full API URL again and not changing that URL at all. And then we need to pass in the post options, so the URL and the options that we've defined. And if you remember, and let's look at our API request, all it returns is the error message. That's all this function returns. Either it's null or it's not, and we have some type of message that we've received, this error.message, for example. So if we look back here, we can just check now in what we've received as our result, and we can say if we have a result, that means the message is not null, then we need to set the fetch error. And of course, when that is not null, it will actually display in our JSX as we've set that up previously. So let's go ahead and save that. And after that save, I want to display the terminal so we can actually see JSON Server at work. And we can scroll this up and then scroll down, and here's all the GET requests that have happened. And these are 304s, by the way, if you notice that. Now, I mentioned a response that is considered to be okay in the 200 range. So why is a 304 okay? And if I reload, I bet we get a 304 again. There it is. Yes, a 304 at the bottom. And that means it's using cached information. It means it doesn't really need to get that information from the server because nothing has changed. Now, a 404 is definitely an error, and a 200 doesn't show right here at the beginning. I guess we've too far past that. A 200 range response means okay, but there's nothing wrong with the 304, and we will not catch that as an error either. So we can reload, we get the 304 here, that's fine, but what if we post an item? Let's see what response we get. So we'll add an item, let's add cookies, and click the plus. We've got cookies, and it was a 201, which is in the okay range, and look, it was a post request now, and so that works as we expected it to. I'm going to close the terminal window again, but I'll press Control B, and let's go ahead and open our data folder on the left with JSON Server, and if we click the db.json, and look, now we've got cookies added to our JSON file as well. So it did update the file as we expected, and it did handle the request as we expected. Now let's go back to the app component, and we'll handle the check now. Let's go ahead and define that. Once again, we already have the code here that updates our state, so we'll just enter in something new below that. I'm going to press Control B once again to hide the file tree, but now we can define the item that is getting updated. As right now, we just handled the list items, and then we updated the full state of the list items, and we essentially just changed the check for the item that was checked. But we'll need to handle this just a little bit differently here. We need to get the item that is checked. So we're going to say const, and I'll just call this my item. And now we can use list items because we've already updated the list items, and now the checked is in the state that it needs to be, essentially. So here we can use list items, and we'll say list items, and we'll once again use filter, and we'll just have the item here and use the arrow and then say the item.id, and this needs to be equal to the ID that was passed in. And so if we do that, we will now have defined my item. And I'm just now noticing I've got item in parentheses here in a couple of spots with filter, and then, or even map, and then I have item not in parentheses. So just to be consistent, I'll go ahead and put this in parentheses, but it's not really required. You wouldn't have to have those. I'm just adding it for consistency. Okay, now define update options, because we are going to update, and we're not posting this time, but update is the word from CRUD. Really, the method we'll use is called patch. So we're going to set this equal to an object, and here we'll define the method, and this will be patch as we're updating just a specific part of a specific record. And now, once again, in the headers, this will be just like before. This is content-type, and this will equal application/JSON. Now that we've defined the header, we'll move down and define the body. And here we once again need to use JSON stringify, and we can pass in a specific bit of JSON here, and we're going to say checked. So just the checked property of this specific item that we're sending with the patch method. And we're going to say my item, but remember now, the filter returns an array. So we have to say my item 0. It's an array with one item, and we're referring to it this way, my item 0 dot checked. So whatever the checked property is, we're not changing the checked property because it was already updated before we accessed the list items here. And that will handle that, sending the correct information. Now that we've defined that object, underneath we need to define the request URL, because this is just a little different than just the URL that we used for get and post. This will be equal to a template literal, and we'll start out with that API URL. But after that we need a slash, and then we need to use, not a space, but we need to use whatever ID was passed in. So if this was post number 1, it would have the ID of 1 right here. So we're accessing a specific post that we're updating with patch. And now we can define our result again. We can set this equal to an await call, which means we need to change this handle check to an async function as well. And here we'll say await, and now we'll put API request. We'll pass in the request URL, and we'll pass in the update options. And now once again, the API request will only return the error message, and that error message is either null or it has a value. So we can just say if we have a result, we know that there is a message that is not null. So we'll set the fetch error and we'll pass in result. And we can save that. And now if we check an item, and we should see it, I'll once again open the terminal so we can see what the request is here. And I will check cookies, and we see the patch request came in, and it was items, but also item with an ID of 4, and then it updated the REST API. So we have cookies checked, and we could uncheck it, and we'll also see a request come in, and it will once again update that. Now let's go ahead and close the terminal, and we'll look at the db.json once again. We've got cookies here. Let's check cookies, and it changes to true right inside our file. It's updated just like that by the JSON server. And if we uncheck, it should go back to false. That's exactly what we expect for the update. Okay, we have created an item, we've updated an item, so really all that is left is to delete an item, because we were reading the items from the previous tutorial to begin with, and that happens right at app load with the fetch. So let's go ahead and update the handle delete, and here you can see we're already updating the state once again. So let's just put a little space here, so we are defining what we need to update the API. That's just a little bit different than updating the state, but of course we're trying to keep those in sync as well. And if we get an error, of course reloading the app will put everything back in sync. So we've got delete options that we're going to define, and that's very simple for a delete. We'll just set the method equal to delete, and really doesn't get much simpler for the options than that. And after that we could have our request URL that we need to define, which is just like above. So we can really copy the request URL because it's also the ID that's passed in, which reminds me we need to change this to async as well, and let's go ahead and do that with lowercase. And then the result is going to be very similar here, so let's copy these other two lines and paste underneath, but instead of the update options, this needs to be delete options. Other than that, the function operates in the same way. So if we get a result back, we want to set that fetch error, and if not, we know there is no error to set. So we can save this as well. Now let's once again open up a terminal. I'm pressing Control and backtick to open that up quickly. And there we've got the items, and once again it was a 304. We didn't need it after we had the 200 with the items because everything was fresh. The GET request with the 200 is what loads them in here. So now let's go ahead and delete cookies and see what we get in the terminal too. We deleted cookies, and now it was our delete request. And once again, we got a 200 response. Everything was good, and that was item 4. So we can check pizza. We got a patch request. Let's uncheck pizza, another patch request because that continues to update it. We can add an item. Let's go ahead and add something new here. Let's get some candy. Add that in. That's a post request. Everything is as we expect it to be. And once again, if we delete candy, we get a delete request. So our CRUD operations are complete. If we reload the full app, we should get the GET request, or at least, yes, we've got GET with the 200 there. So everything was as we expect it to be. Our create, read, update, and delete options, all of our CRUD operations are functioning, and we have eliminated using local storage. Hey, thank you guys so much for liking the video if it helped you get started with React. Also, I appreciate you watching and subscribing. It's helping my channel grow. Take care, and I'll see you again very soon.